between the US and the Russians, they have more or less the area of 43 to 4,500 nuclear weapons each. When he talked about the other weapons that he has available, that nuclear weapons, as well as other non-conventional weapons, whether chemical or biological, all of those are threats. The same as the United States has all of those weapons and has used versions of them over the years. So I think it's a mistake to say, well, maybe he didn't really use the word nuclear, and therefore we don't have to take seriously that there is a serious danger of nuclear escalation. Again, not necessarily because Putin has any intention of launching such an attack. I don't think he does, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. I don't think President Biden has any intention to do so. That doesn't mean it can't happen from our side as well. When those weapons exist, until they are completely abolished, when those weapons exist, there is the danger that they could be used. And that's an enormous danger. It's a very small chance. But when that chance is anything other than zero, that's way too big, no matter how small it may seem.
And I think one of the most irresponsible things we're seeing from the media is the over vilification of Putin, because he's been compared to Hitler again and again. And the
Right.
takeaway from that is clearly you don't negotiate. It's this Munich, this is appeasement. Can you kind of shed light on how, well, first of all, he's not Hitler. That doesn't mean you like Putin, but I think it's pretty irresponsible to suggest that he is. But also how, regardless of one's thoughts on Putin, obviously you have to negotiate. I mean, people were saying you can't negotiate with him because you can't trust him. Well, if that's true, what's the end game?
That's exactly the right question. What's the end game here? The notion that this is going to lead to some kind of World War II style total victory by Ukraine over the entire Russian military or the entire Russian government or something, and a surrender by Russia, I think is wishful thinking. That's never going to happen. I think we're even hearing from officials in Washington these days that it's not possible for either side to win this in an all-sided military victory. It's going to result in some level of a war of attrition. And the question is, are we going to get into negotiations sooner with fewer people killed, or keep fighting for much longer, resulting in far more people killed and far more destruction? So those are the options. The options are not, we're going to fight to the finish and the finish is going to be beautiful and we're going to have a surrender somewhere and a flag raising and it's all going to be great. That's not going to happen. So that's part of it. But the other part of it, I think, is important. I think it's always foolish to make these kinds of comparisons, whether it's comparisons to Hitler, comparisons to the Holocaust. Horrific realities that people at war, people whose countries are at war, have to live under are horrific. And comparing them to each other doesn't do any good. It is important to look at history. If we look at, not is Putin Hitler, but is Russia in 2022 an appropriate parallel to Germany, say, in 1935? And I would say absolutely not. Germany in 1935 was on the rise as a leading economic power. Its industrial might was unsurpassed in Europe. Its wealth, its power was huge and rising. Russia is now a second-rate economic power. The US, if this figure of about $65 billion that the US has sent to Ukraine in these last 8 months, is the entire military budget of Russia last year, right? So the Russian military, and we're seeing it now, its inability to hold any of these pieces of territory that it's seized. The Russian leadership is forced to do these massive recruiting campaigns that are not succeeding. People are fleeing to other countries to avoid serving in the military. So this is not a powerful military force that's on the rise, or a powerful economic force that's poised to take over Europe or take over the world. It's a weak second-rate power that is launching these horrific attacks against civilian targets because that's what it's capable of with a second-rate army. That means a lot more people are going to die, a lot more cities are going to be destroyed, and Russia is still not going to, quote, win the war. Nor is Ukraine going to be able to stop that kind of assault from far away. So the question is not, do we negotiate? The question is, when do we negotiate? How do we negotiate? How do we get to negotiations sooner rather than later so that Ukraine can be leading a diplomatic process in its own right, and the US can be part of a diplomatic process with its leading global opponent in Europe, which is Russia, over these other critical matters. There needs to be an entirely new so-called security apparatus in Russia, in Europe, in all of Europe. And it needs to include Russia. It needs to include Belarus. It needs to include all of Europe in a way that was just beginning to be thought about after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That was the whole basis of the conversation, where the promise was made that the Russians would accept the reunification of Germany as a Western power in return for an agreement that NATO would not be moved further east. And we know what happened. But the reason for that whole conversation was precisely because there was a need to rework what was Europe now that the Iron Curtain had been lifted. So the question is, what's Europe going to be now? What we know is it's going to be completely militarized in a way that Europe has not been since before the end of the Cold War. You know, when we have now an agreement by countries like Germany that had never agreed to send weapons abroad are suddenly eager to send weapons to Ukraine. We have countries like Sweden and Finland, who had prided themselves on staying outside of the military blocs, clamoring now to join NATO. We have all these countries saying, we'll raise 2% of our entire GDP and put it into the military, something that almost all these countries had never been willing to do, despite US pressure. And what it means is that the project of Europe, which claimed, somewhat falsely, but it was an aspirational claim, that Europe is the project of human rights, is not even on the table anymore. Now, Europe is the project of militarism. And that's a defeat for all of us, for the whole world.